in Times Square, the publishing center of the world.
Yes, and we have one of the most prolific writers ever of graphic design. You get to meet him.
Stephen Heller.
Yes.
Stephen Heller, welcome to the show. I think it is safe to say you are probably the most prolific design writer of our time.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, how many books are we up to these days?
I've written about 180 books.
Only 180.
Yeah.
I feel like you're writing. I don't know how you're doing it, but you're writing one right now. I'm not sure how you're doing it.
There's a program at home.
Okay. Wow. I didn't know we were there yet. Hopefully, it's an Adobe program.
We'll see.
I would want to know how you get even started writing with writing books, being a graphic designer.
Well, you know, it happened right around here, because I worked at the New York Times for 33 years on 43rd Street. This whole Times Square area has been my beat for a long time, up until about 8 or 9 years ago. Basically, when I started, I was an English major at NYU. So I kind of wanted to write, I just didn't know what I wanted to write. Instead of being an English major, I started working for an underground newspaper, and I got thrown into the role of being an art director. And as an art director, I found that I was writing headlines, I was writing captions, I was writing stupid little advertisements, and it just kind of evolved. To the point where one day, an editor asked me if I would write a profile about an illustrator. As hard as it was, and as uncomfortable as it was, I really liked the idea of seeing words of mine in print. And it became quite addictive, if not pathological.
Ah, this is interesting, because you are right. We were just talking a bit ago, and I think you said ego was your answer.
Well, ego was a driver. In part because I was the art director of the op-ed page at the New York Times, and at the New York Times you don't have a masthead. You have a masthead for the chief editors. So any of the rest of us who were art directors or designers or whatever, we were anonymous. Therefore, our parents said, "We don't believe you work there." And I just wanted my name on something, because it had been on something prior to. So doing my first book was a way to have a name seen. And you know, it's an intoxicating drug. When I was designing and slash art directing, I would do 2-3 magazines every couple of weeks. So there was just a plethora of things that made me feel like I was worth something. Prior to that, I was just a bad student. I was a pain in the ass. I was mostly kind of rebellious. So this was a way of kind of, in a sense, finding not just my voice, but finding my skin. And I think writing about design, at the time I started, writing about illustration and cartooning at the time I started, was a pretty narrow field, pretty arcane. And since I was the one that was doing it, when people needed something done, they'd come to me. So it was satisfying in that regard.
So you mentioned the underground newspaper. How does one get into an underground newspaper? Did you start it? Did you just stumble into it?
Here?
Oh.
In 1967, when I was just about ready to graduate high school, there were a number of undergrounds in New York. They were left-wing, they were sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were places that were alternative to what mainstream media was and what the mainstream was at that time. We were beginning to get heavily into the Vietnam War. We were within the civil rights movement. New York, being the bubble it's always been, was still kind of conservative. And this was a way to kind of flex my muscles and flex the muscles of other people like me. Being in New York kind of puts you in touch with what we would conceivably call the avant-garde, although once you call it the avant-garde, it's no longer avant-garde.
Yeah, and it's probably, I'm sure it's a matter of partly because you're there and partly because of your location, and just, you know, everything kind of fell into place.
Everything fell into place. And yeah, it was a wonderful time because you stumbled into things.
It was probably kind of awesome and kind of cutting edge in terms of design.
Well,
the
I didn't
time, or
even know
no?
what design was.
Okay, you're
I
just,
never studied
you were just-
design. I studied art. I went to the Museum of Modern Art school for not a semester, but a session. They threw me out because I was something of a juvenile delinquent.
Oh, really?
But
You
at
were
the same
trouble.
time, I had fun. I learned about surrealism. I learned about Dada. This was at a pretty young age. I went to the Art Students League for a little while. I was never a great drawer, but I always had this desire to become a cartoonist, like some of the leading alternative cartoonists at the time, Jules Feiffer, R. Crumb, people like that. So I was in a certain trajectory, and it just so happened that I stumbled in something where I had to design, and therefore I had to be taught what design was. All the things that people now find in that box or laptop called the computer, these were things I had to learn about on the street, and now they're everybody's vocabulary. Everybody does it, whether they're writing a letter or sending something off to their friends as a card or whatever.
Yeah, you kind of take it for granted these
Yeah.
days, you know?
Yeah,
It
but
is
it wasn't.
interesting. I mean, kids and students are much more design savvy than any time before. I feel like they're familiar with design. They know about it, and I think it's because it's become so much a part of everyday life in many ways.
Yeah, and then even anybody can publish anything at any given time, really, kind of with social media and phones and everything. Which is,
And it used to be that we could do that on a really primitive Xerox machine. I used to do posters for some local bands. And again, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was lettering, and then I'd put it through a Xerox machine, which always took the blacks out and left you with these shady grays. But I'd put it in a portfolio, and I'd say, this is my artwork. Again, it's much more available today, and people see it more as an opportunity today. But for me, it was really this ecstatic and revealing and enormously empowering opportunity that I would never have thought I'd have.
if you had to recommend a book to anyone, could you do that of yours? Or
Of
is that too
mine?
hard? Oh, man.
Ooh.
I don't
That's-
know.
that's a hard one.
question.
I mean, it's not like picking my favorite child or Sophie's
Right.
Choice or anything, but my books tend to be kind of niche-y. You know, there are books that teach you how to design that have a real functional purpose. Mine tend to have a more philosophical bent or a historical leaning, or I'm kind of being a voyeur through the book. There are lots of books that I would say that people should read. One of them is called Design Literacy. But it's not going to teach anybody how to be a designer. It's just going to bring people into, it's going to allow them to have knowledge of what certain objects of design are. I mean, one of the things that I didn't realize until much later in my own career is how important individual objects were. You know, there's the New York Times. I worked for the New York Times. I did the op-ed page. I did the book review. But if you look at those from a historical lens, well, illustration changed. The way people communicated changed. The way the process of making those publications changed. And I think those are important things to know as a human being, small or niche as they are.
So I'm curious, do you ever go back to what you have written in the past or on the Daily Heller and just adamantly disagree with what you wrote?
Yes. Not with the Daily Heller, because once the Daily Heller's done, the day is over and that time has passed. And even though there's an archive, I just don't go back. But there have been a couple of articles that I've written over time that I go back to, and I feel like I didn't understand what I was talking about. But that's always the problem of having something that stays with you forever.
Another random question. I wonder if you've ever decided to Google something you wanted to know about and discover a book that you've written Like you have already written something, you're researching.
Yes.
Your name comes up, right?
I've done that many times.
Anyways, that's fascinating.
Well, with 180 books, I imagine that
I
has
know.
to
I don't even own 180. I don't think. I better
Well,
get
it's
on
not
that.
even the books; it's the stories.
Right.
By nature, I don't have a great long-term memory, and I will find something and say, I did that, and
Well, I think just kind of going back to what you said before, a lot of your books provide this sort of like voyeur, like insight to how things run, and I think that's what's so helpful to a lot of people who are looking to become designers. You know, I know when I got your typography sketchbooks, like that was just amazing to me to see all the different ways that people are sketching, and just it gave me that little insight, which was really nice.
well, that's good to hear because
Yeah.
we have Volume 2 coming out
Oh, do
shortly.
you?
Yeah, it's called Freehand. They didn't want to do the same title.
Right.
But what I love about that book, and there are 3 or 4 others in the series of sketchbooks, is seeing how people think and seeing how people work.
Have you ever like signed up to write a book and you know nothing about the subject matter? Have you ever? I'm
Yes.
just because it's encouraging to hear that. Like if I ever want to write a book, I kind of don't know about it, but you're like, yeah, I could probably learn.
No, I've done that with a couple of books. I don't even remember whether they've
we
been
don't have
published
to-
or not.
Yeah, you did.
But I've certainly done that with articles where somebody has called and I've felt like, well, I want to know about the subject. So they're not asking me whether I know something or not. They're just asking me to do it. So I may not get it all right, but I've gotten something for myself out of it. And if I don't get it right, that's where God gave us editors.
What ideas are knocking around in your head for maybe future books or maybe something you're working on now that you can let us know about?
Well, there's one thing I'm trying to do now, and it's not an idea per se. It's a form, which will undeniably have ideas within it, and that's a memoir.
Cool.
First, I have to get over the idea that a memoir is kind of self-aggrandizing, self-serving. I've read a lot of other people's memoirs and realized that, you know, you can do it without patting yourself on the back. In fact, revealing more than you have to, TMI. This is something that I hope I'm able to accomplish. But a memoir is putting yourself out there.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure. Well, I feel like we got a little bit of memoir.
I
at
know.
least today in your home
Video
city.
memoir.
Video memoir, if you will. Thoroughly fascinating, and I need to get right on finishing all these 180 books before we meet again.
Write me when you
Yeah,
get
get
them
with
all
it, Paul.
done.
I got a job to do. But people could also follow you online because they probably want to be up to date on what you're producing on a regular basis. So
Well, I do the Daily Heller for print magazine, and that has a long form and a short form to it. And sometimes it's just what I happen to be thinking for a moment.
well, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for
Well, thank you.
letting
Yeah.
us steal you away for a little bit, even though I think there is an Adobe program that's writing a book for you right now. from what
Right. And hopefully there'll be an Adobe program that keeps me alive longer.
I don't know. Who knows where we're going in the future, huh?
You never know.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a lot.
much.
Stephen Heller.
Appreciate it.